Florida.
Richard Johnson watching this unfold from London. He's a lecturer in US politics at Queen Mary University. Thank you for joining us. I mean, we've got a climate skeptic now potentially running, the energy brief. You've got a vaccine skeptic running the health brief potentially as well. What do you think Donald Trump is trying to say and do here?
Elections have consequences, and Trump is using probably the moment that he has maximum political influence, I would say much more so than 8 years ago when he came into the White House, to try to put in and install people who are of his mindset in top positions. This is going to be very difficult for some Republican senators. He has a different Senate now than he did 8 years ago. And what I mean by that is that Republican elected officials have learned that if they cross Trump, they jeopardize their position, because many of the Republican senators and congressmen and other officials who went against Trump in the days gone by, they lost primary challenges. And so even those Republican senators who may have serious reservations over some of these nominees, and more is coming out about them day by day, they're going to be under intense pressure from the Republican grassroots to stay loyal to Trump. And that's the test that they'll be under over the next couple of months.
And if we look at the Senate, it is much more MAGA than it was last time Trump came to power, of course. I mean, what sort of numbers are we talking about of moderate Republicans who could be swayed or go with their own conscience?
Well, the two that immediately come to mind are Susan Collins in Maine and Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, who have demonstrated at various intervals some degree of independence from Donald Trump. They were part of the trio that killed Trump's attempt in his first term to repeal Obamacare, along with John McCain, who of course has passed away. Trump can afford to lose those two votes. He can afford to lose a third vote. If the vote is 50-50 in the Senate, then J.D. Vance, as the president of the Senate, casts the casting vote. I think there are other senators who are not dyed-in-the-wool Trump supporters, but have, as I was sort of saying before, they're going to be much more reticent in directly challenging Trump, at least publicly. But I think one thing that's interesting, if I may say, is that if we look at the leadership election for the Republican leader, the stated preferences of the senators are somewhat different from the revealed preferences. And what I mean by that is that John Thune, who's a more moderate figure than Rick Scott, won the election in a secret ballot. And of course, these nominations, these confirmation votes are not a secret vote. And I do think that if it was a secret ballot, Trump would probably lose a lot more of these confirmation votes than he will when it's on the record ballot, because the Republican grassroots voters who vote in the primaries will be able to follow along and put pressure on their senators.
And what about the idea that people are being put in charge of departments who don't believe in what those departments have been doing? It's going to be a challenge, isn't it, keeping the departments on board for a start? But, there are issues with the way these places are often run. There always are, because they're big organisations. And a lot of people will be thinking they do need to be disrupted.
Well, this is actually a much longer standing tactic of the sort of conservative political movement in the United States. I mean, you can go back to the Reagan administration, when President Reagan installed people as the head of the Housing and Urban Development, or in the Justice Department, or in the Economic Opportunity Office, who weren't really believers in what we might call the kind of founding mission of many of these departments, who certainly felt that these departments were much more proactive than they ought to be. Trump, in his first administration, also installed people whose personal politics often went against the sort of historic mission of agencies like, say, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. And so we're seeing a continuation and an intensification of that. In the last administration, there was some internal pushback from career civil servants. And there are accounts of the first Trump presidency where career civil servants did, in some cases, seemed to soft pedal some of the moves that were coming out from Trump and his closest advisors. This time, the Trump administration is going to be, I think, much more determined to root out internal dissidents as they would see it. And what that probably means is removing some of the employment protections that some civil servants have, or at least threatening that as a way of ensuring compliance with the mission of the agency heads.
OK, Richard, as ever, thank you so much for joining us today with your analysis.